Number 7. Hakan Aysel. In June of 2018, 40-year-old Hakan Aysel and his wife, Semra, aged 32, were vacationing in the city of Muğla, Turkey. Semra was 7 months pregnant at the time. For a couple of hours, the couple was taking photos atop a cliff overlooking the sea. At some point, Semra went over the edge and suffered a fatal fall. It was initially regarded as a tragic accident, and Hakan claimed that his wife had slipped. 2 years later, the authorities arrested him on suspicion of having pushed his wife off of the cliff. The prosecution stated that he'd waited until there were no witnesses before killing Semra. He'd allegedly done so to claim her life insurance policy, estimated at nearly $60,000, of which he was the sole beneficiary. The victim's family discovered that Hakan had also taken a number of loans in Semra's name over the course of their marriage. The investigation is ongoing, but if found guilty, Hakan faces life in prison. Number 6. Michael Martin Jr. In June of 2018, an Australian man was convicted of murdering his father with a samurai sword in order to collect on the insurance policies he'd previously taken out on his life. 46-year-old Michael Martin Sr. and his estranged son, Michael Jr., reconnected in 2013. The former, then 25 years old, reached out to his father. A reported alcoholic, the man had been violent and neglectful towards his son as he was growing up. Nevertheless, Michael Jr. appeared willing to have a relationship with his father. In February of 2014, he took out 3 life insurances on him, with a cumulative worth of $2.5 million. In April, Michael Sr. and a friend who was staying the night in his Murwillumbah home were the victims of a violent home invasion in which they were beaten and stabbed. Both men sustained life-threatening injuries, but they survived with medical intervention. The attack left Michael Sr. with multiple fractures, loss of sight in one eye, septic shock, and the need for dialysis. His son is believed to have been behind the attack. Michael Jr. regularly visited his father in the hospital and drove him home once he was released. Less than 2 days later, Michael Sr. was found dead at his residence in what his son had staged to look like another random home invasion. Martin Jr. was found bound but uninjured, while his father had been stabbed 16 times with a samurai sword. The fatal blows had pierced the man's heart. The killing, which a judge claimed had been executed with a cold-blooded determination, was connected to Michael Jr., and he was sentenced to a maximum of 37 years in prison. Number 5. Paula Leeson. In June of 2017, British woman Paula Leeson and husband Donald McPherson, both 47, were vacationing at a cottage in Norwegian, a remote village in Denmark. While at the cottage, Leeson drowned in an indoor pool that was only 4 foot deep. 13 separate injuries were found on her body. McPherson, who maintained his innocence, became the main suspect when it emerged that he'd taken out multiple life insurance policies on his wife in the years leading up to her death. The woman knew nothing about the policies, which amounted to nearly $5 million. She was also set to inherit a fortune from her family's successful construction business, something that McPherson reportedly resented. Handwriting experts concluded that forms on payout documents, which would have benefited the woman's son from a previous marriage, were also forged so that the money would be diverted to McPherson. In the ensuing trial, the prosecution alleged that McPherson had killed his wife for the insurance money and then also tampered with her will. The trial collapsed in March of 2021 after a judge concluded that the prosecution's case had been built on circumstantial evidence. The jury was directed to a not guilty verdict, with the judge arguing that while the murder hypothesis was clearly more likely, there wasn't enough evidence to support it. Even though many suspected that he'd killed his wife, McPherson was a free man. Number 4. Carl Carlson. In order to collect on the insurance money, New York man Carl Carlson murdered his wife and then his own son 17 years later. In 1991, Carlson and his wife Christina were living in California with their 3 children. On New Year's Day, the woman died in a house fire, which at the time was ruled as an accident. In the weeks leading up to her death, Carlson had taken out a life insurance policy on his wife, from which he collected $200,000. Only 4 days after the fire, he moved back to his native New York with the children. In November of 2008, 23-year-old Levi Carlson was working on his father's truck. The vehicle fell off the jack and fatally crushed the young man, who was a father of 2. Carlson had convinced Levi a few weeks before his death to get a life insurance policy on himself and make him the sole beneficiary, under the guise that he'd administered a distribution of the money to his children. He collected $700,000, and Levi's death was considered accidental. By 2012, Carlson's second marriage to Cindy Best had started to fall apart. She had serious suspicions that he'd been responsible for Christina and Levi's deaths. Best hired a private investigator to look into her husband and was shocked to discover that he'd get $1.2 million in the event of her demise. After contacting the police, she agreed to wear a wire and get her husband to talk about Christina and Levi. When talking about his son's death, the man said that he saw an opportunity and took advantage of the situation. Carlson was arrested. After he was sentenced for killing his son, the authorities found enough evidence to connect him to Christina's death as well. The fire had been started deliberately, and she'd succumbed to smoke inhalation in a bathroom, the window of which Carlson had previously boarded up. For his crimes, Carlson would spend the rest of his life in prison. Number 3. Brenda Andrew. Brenda Andrew is currently the only woman on Oklahoma's death row. In 1984, she married her high school sweetheart, Rob, with whom she had 2 children. By the 1990s, the couple's relationship became strained. Brenda, a Sunday school teacher, was reportedly verbally abusive towards Rob and had started having extramarital affairs. The couple separated. In November of 2001, Rob stopped by to pick up his children, and Brenda asked him to check the furnace pilot light in the garage. A few moments later, the woman called 911, claiming that 2 gunmen had attacked them. Rob was shot dead, while she was wounded in the arm. It wasn't long before the investigators discovered that she'd been seeing insurance agent James Pavitt. He'd recently sold Rob an $800,000 life insurance policy, which named Brenda the sole beneficiary. Rob had become suspicious after an incident in which he discovered his brake lines had been severed. He'd tried to remove Brenda from the life insurance policy, but James told him it couldn't be done. Rob contacted a man superior and then confided in him that he believed his estranged wife and her lover were trying to kill him. The authorities suspect that the couple had executed Rob in the garage with his own 16-gauge shotgun, which Brenda had kept when he moved out. James then shot her in the arm in a failed attempt to throw the police off their trail. In the aftermath of the killing, James and Brenda fled the country. A few months later, they were arrested at the Mexican border. They were sentenced to death in separate trials. Number 2. Robert Wayne Feldman. In February of 2018, 53-year-old Denver man Robert Wayne Feldman was arrested for the first-degree murder of his wife, Stacy. Feldman had called 911 in March of 2015, claiming that he'd found his wife unresponsive in the shower. He told officers she'd taken marijuana and edibles at a party the night before. Feldman reported that he'd last seen her in the morning before taking the children to school and that she wasn't feeling well. Suspicions rose as no THC was found in her system, but homicide couldn't be proven. In June of 2015, Feldman collected on his wife's $750,000 life insurance, which he'd taken out on her a few years prior. A woman that Feldman had cheated on Stacy with then contacted the authorities. They'd met through Tinder, and the man had lied to her, claiming he wasn't married. After finding him on social media, the woman contacted Stacy via email. Phone records revealed that the two had spoken on the morning of her death, sharing in the fury that they'd been deceived by Feldman. Hours later, Stacy was dead. In December of 2017, an expert reviewed all the evidence gathered in the investigation and concluded that Stacy had died as a result of strangulation or suffocation. Number 1. Kwame Wilson. In 2020, aspiring rapper Kwame Wilson, known to his followers as Young QC, was sentenced to 99 years in prison for ordering the killing of his own mother, Yolanda Holmes. The 45-year-old woman was beloved in her Chicago community. She owned the Nappy Head Salon, a successful salon which she'd often used to host or publicize community events. In 2012, Holmes was attacked at her home in the 1000 block of West Montrose Avenue. The gunman was identified as 22-year-old Eugene Spencer, who'd been driven to the address by Lorianna Johnson, aged 23. Holmes was shot in the head and stabbed multiple times. Phone records would later indicate that Wilson was in contact with the attackers before, during, and after the killing. Only a week after his mother's brutal slaying, he emptied out her bank accounts and collected her 2 life insurance policies. In the aftermath, Wilson was seen throwing cash into the crowds at his shows. He also customized his Mustang, which his mother had bought him. Once the murder plot was uncovered by the authorities, all 3 conspirators were arrested. Spencer and Johnson confessed to their role in the killing. Similar to Wilson, the hitman was sentenced to 100 years in prison. Thanks for watching. If you could insure one part of your body for $1 million, which would it be and why? Let us know in the comments section below.